economy added 272,000 jobs. Will this economic growth affect the upcoming election? Gordon Gray is executive director of the Pinpoint Policy Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational organization dedicated to promoting and defending essential pillars such as free markets and policies that foster economic growth. He's joining me now with more. Gordon, thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's talk about this. We have the jobs report coming out. The Biden administration actually had an embarrassing moment a few months ago when it was found that the numbers had been inflated and they had to be readjusted, the numbers for November and December. So now they have to kind of deal with what is, it is what it is going into the election. Talk to us about this report.
Sure. So, first of all, it's important to remember that when this report comes out, it's actually reflecting two different surveys. The first one is called the payroll survey, and essentially the Department of Labor calls up and has a questionnaire for 666,000 employers across the United States. And it asks them basic questions about how many people they've added to their job roles, how much they're paying them, how long they've been working, how many hours they work, and stuff like that. And that's where that number, that 272,000 jobs created number comes from. That's the payroll survey. It's a very reliable survey, and it's updated and revised several times. The second survey is called the household survey, and that's where the Department of Labor calls up households and families and asks them similar questions, but from a different perspective. And that's where the unemployment rate comes from. And so when a jobs report comes out, sometimes we can get slightly different stories or sometimes very different stories. And in the case of the report on Friday, we got a little different story there. We had 272,000 jobs created. That's from the payroll survey, but also unemployment went up about 1/10 of a percentage point based on responses from the household survey. They told slightly different stories there.
Yeah, and so what the story that's never told in these jobs reports is how many people who are reporting that they have a new job or employers that are reporting that they have hired people, if that is their second or third job. I was watching some YouTube videos and I even found cross references on Instagram and TikTok of this new reality for Americans where almost everyone admits they have some kind of a side hustle. They resell their own clothing, they make earrings. The husbands have taken on consulting work. Some people have gone back to school, but not to get their own educations, to teach a class because you can teach just one class per semester if you have a bachelor's degree. If you have a master's, you can be an actual professor as a part-time job. And so if you think about all the different things people are doing, dog walking, babysitting, lawn mowing on the weekend, things that we used to think of as being, some of these things maybe a teenager might do, grown-ups are doing these things to make ends meet, to survive in the Biden economy. I don't know that the jobs report actually reflects those realities, which can make it difficult to live.
So that's a great issue you raised, and the jobs data we get does actually try to answer that question. It does disentangle how many people are working multiple jobs, and then it digs in a little bit more into whether or not that person is working a full-time job plus a part-time job or two part-time jobs, and it does try to dig into some of that. One challenge, however, though, and you spoke to this, is that some of these jobs are part of this new gig economy, and we don't do such a great job capturing those kind of jobs. And that was actually part of the resilience of the American people during the pandemic was, people taking on new opportunities. And it can be complicated because in this economy, we want to make sure that people have flexibility. And so for some people, some of these gig jobs are actually great. It lets them work however long they want to and try to accommodate other aspects of their lives. But we don't want to have an economy, as you said, where people are forced to take on jobs they otherwise wouldn't to make ends meet. And that's where that inflation piece is coming in, where prices are getting ever higher, and it's harder and harder for some families to get by on the paycheck that they're earning through their regular job. So it can be a complicated question.
I think so. And when the other part is, I think the headline that I always see, and it's different for me because I look at the data coming from websites that actually examine this, organizations like your own at the Pinpoint Policy Institute, where you look at this far more deeply. But most Americans just hear the top lines. They see on their news app, maybe they're looking at Apple News, they'll see in May the US economy added 272,000 jobs. They'll think, wow, that's way better than the, couple months ago when it only added 165,000 jobs. The economy must be improving. But then they go to the grocery store, the prices are still very high, everything still costs more. And so they
Yep.
feel a bit of a disconnect, or even as if they're being possibly gaslit. Why doesn't my reality look the same as these jobs reports? So the deeper knowledge doesn't actually get that far into the news reports. They devote maybe 60 seconds to the jobs report. They don't talk about people working more than one job or driving Uber or Lyft or DoorDash to make ends meet.
So you make a great point here, which is it's all well and good, and it's important for the government, the statistical agencies, to collect this data and kind of keep their finger on the pulse of the broad economy. But one piece of this jobs report that speaks to what you were talking about is how fast are wages growing for Americans? And in the last jobs report, we actually saw that hourly earnings for folks went up to a fairly at a fairly high rate, of over 4% for the year. However, the other piece of that, and we're going to get some more data later this month, is the rate of inflation. And unfortunately, since the beginning of this year, inflation has outpaced that earnings growth, and it's been that way since President Biden took office. So wage growth can be strong, but if prices are outpacing that wage growth, then frankly, you can tell folks that the economy is growing, and that's all well and good, but it doesn't mean anything if people are falling further and further behind.
That's true. And so, as we were talking, I mentioned your organization, the Pinpoint Policy Institute. Tell us what your organization does and how we can find out more about it.
Great, thanks so much for asking. So we're at www.pinpointpolicyinstitute.org, and we're a nonprofit policy research organization, and we frankly think that the United States has a great story to tell. We're the world's largest economy, and we deliver the highest standard of living to our citizens compared to other major economies. But we have some challenges, and I think we all know that. And so when I look at the policy landscape, frankly, it's like the song. I got some clowns to the left of me and frankly, a few jokers to the right. And my job is to protect, promote, and defend what makes the U.S. Economy as vibrant and dynamic as it has been. And frankly, let's try not to mess that up.
So the headline on your website is promoting and defending the essential pillars of America's economic growth and prosperity. And you have the point 21 and 25, why Congress should hold a line on the corporate rate. You also talk about the latest news, a story from the Washington Times about tariffs. So you have a right-leaning view of what we can do in this country economically to advance. Do you have anything that you could share with us and our viewers relating to what would be good economic policy by an incoming administration, whether it's term 2 of the Biden administration or the Trump administration part 2 after a break? What would you like to see as a policy wonk here in this space?
So great, thanks so much for asking. So my first prescription would be like doctors, the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. And I'm afraid that under both President Biden and President Trump, there are some policies that they're for, and my piece in the Washington Times speak to this, which is raising trade barriers. And global trade fundamentally has been good for the United States. We can compete even with countries like China. And I'm afraid that when we raise trade barriers, ultimately we're just harming ourselves. And ultimately, the policy response that we get when we raise trade barriers isn't a good one. Eventually, we face retaliation. And at the end of the day, the people holding the bag are American consumers. And so that's on the trade piece. One of the things I'd like us to see to step back from are trade wars and trade barriers. The other thing is that we need to stop the massive run-up in debt that we've seen, particularly under the Biden administration, the Trump administration, and frankly, all previous presidents, and essentially in my lifetime. We are kicking the can down the road to future generations. We are stealing the prosperity of future generations by promising them major debt that will be a major challenge to repay. And it's threatening, I think, future prosperity of this country.
So speaking of the debt, I think one of the things that is most concerning is I'm old enough to remember when we had the debt clock. It used to be something that people trumpeted all over the news. It didn't matter what news organization. You could see it on CNN, the debt clock. And I
That's
also
right.
remember a time when there was $33,000 debt for every man, woman, and child. Now that number is something like 289,000 for every man, woman, and child, and no one ever talks about it. So how do regular people get their congressional members to care about spending again? They don't seem to care about it anymore.
You're absolutely right, and it's a real challenge. And part of that is, I'm old enough to remember when we had balanced budgets, briefly, but we did. And folks who remember that um, may uh, may look fondly on that and say, why don't we just balance the budget again? The problem is the way we balanced the budget in the 90s is not the way we can balance the budget now. Right now, most of the federal budget is being spent on health and retirement programs. So that's your Medicare, your Social Security, your Medicaid. And as we all know, those programs are very difficult to change. People pay into them, and there is a real sense of importance in these programs to people.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, the reality is we spend more out of those programs than people paid in, and that's just a
yeah.
very difficult conversation we're going to have.
Well, we'll have to leave it there and save that for our next chat. So good to have you here. We'll
So,
talk to you again. Gordon Gray, Executive Director, Pinpoint Policy Institute. Thanks for coming on.
thanks so much for having me.